Hello, welcome back. Today I am at my house. You can see the nice photograph of Hayden Valley and Yellowstone behind my head. If you ever get a chance to go to Yellowstone, it's a pretty awesome place. So my wife and I like to do some traveling to national parks. And one of the cool things would be I would be once heard at a national park is that, in Europe, they have like old stuff like castles and things like that. And we don't really have that. We're not that old of a country. What we do have is just some incredible natural beauty in our parks and things like that. So um, that really has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, except for it does reinforce the idea of place and sense of place and the importance of place. And I wanted to just kind of call back to that um, today because it really does feed into our discussion today about culture. We're going to talk about culture today, and culture is a very big, 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 big concept. In my course, when we teach it, it's basically 3 chapters of the book. We do culture, language, and religion together because language and religion are very important pieces of culture. So we're going to talk about some different elements of culture today. Anyway, but before we do that, I do want to go back to the idea of place and the importance of place. Once again, last week we talked about why do people stay in their home or return to their homes after hurricanes, or why do refugees try to return home to their home place after horrible things have happened to them there. And it's this idea that people begin to attach very important and very deep personal meaning to places and to locations. And that idea of what makes a location unique from other places is not only its physical characteristics, but the way that people perceive that place. So it's that idea that even though it may be hot or miserable or not necessarily the nicest place to be in terms of being hospitable, it's your place. You understand it. You have history. You have significance to a particular place, and therefore you tend to build those connections to it. So that's kind of where we're going to go today with culture, because culture is very similar to that. Culture is basically learned behaviors that kind of make up the way that we, one, interact with each other, to the way that we see and construct the world, and how we as human beings leave our mark on the physical environment is often an element of culture, or a mark of culture, or the distinguishing concept of culture. So a couple of things that I want to come back to is that idea of culture is being learned. Now, I know that can be a little confusing sometimes and a little difficult concept, because there are elements that people would say, well, how is this learned? I've always done this. And the way that to think about this is that culture can change. And that's actually one of the big important concepts in when we talk about culture, is culture change. So, but because culture can change, it implies that culture is learned. You are not born with a set of religious beliefs. You may be handed down to those. You may adopt those from your family. You're not born with a language. You learn that throughout. You're not born with a worldview or a way of dressing or a particular food that you eat. All of those things are given to you, and you learn them, and you learn to make them important to you. But once again, so when we talk about culture, one of the big important concepts is culture change. And we want to talk about a couple of concepts, vocabulary that go along with that. One is the idea of acculturation. So when cultures come together, one group and another group come together for in some way, whether it be through migration, like we talked about last week, whether it be through trade, whether it be through technology like television or radio or the internet or things like that. Anytime a culture from one place comes into a culture from another place, there is some interaction, there is some borrowing, there is some give and take that goes on in those particular contexts. And I want us to keep those things in mind, because ultimately those things when those cultures come together, neither culture remains exactly the same. There's always going to be some change. There's going to be some borrowing, some adoption of ideas from other cultures. And really how a society reacts to that, or how a culture reacts to those changes and interactions, is a very important concept that we want to understand when we think about culture as it relates to us. So the first thing is acculturation, and acculturation simply talks about the concept of cultural borrowing and cultural interaction. Okay, so when a culture comes together with another culture, then there is some giving and taking. But the thing about acculturation is you can have some exchange and some interaction, and the two cultures still remain unique and distinctive. So you can still see two different things there, two different parts of culture, or two different identities, or two different things, not just one. Okay. The other piece of that is a bigger deal and is in many ways scary is this word assimilation. And the word assimilation implies, I'm sorry, I'm having some issue with my power cords. I'm trying to find my backup power cord as I'm talking to you. Okay, so assimilation implies that as cultures interact, one or both or more of the interacting things are no longer recognizable after the fact, right? So cultures come together and they interact to a point that the original cultures are no longer recognizable or are no longer unique or original to themselves. Now, the way this usually happens, and why this word tends to be kind of scary and kind of frightening to a lot of people and to a lot of geographers and a lot of anthropologists, is that usually assimilation implies some kind of power imbalance. Assimilation implies that there is a powerful group that is forcing another group adopt their culture. For example, this was very common around the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century in the U.S., as the U.S. tried to force Native Americans to adopt Anglo-type traditions or dominant, traditions in terms of the way they dressed. They would make them cut their hair, not their native language. This idea of culturally changing people so that their own culture no longer exists is a big part of the way that powerful groups try to subordinate or try to control weaker groups within a society. But assimilation is this idea that we are going to, as the interaction occurs, the uniqueness or individuality of a particular culture just disappears, so that it's no longer there. So those are two vocabularies that are kind of on a continuum, where you have acculturation on one end and you have assimilation on the other one. It's probably before a lot of y'all's time, but when I was growing up, one of the shows that I used to watch was called Star Trek Next Generation, for those of you Trekkies out there. And one of the alien groups that Captain Picard and the crew of the Enterprise would always run into was this group called the Borg. And the Borg, basically, their spaceship was this giant cube. And then and what the Borg would do is they would capture you, and they would basically suck out your brain somehow, and make you just this robotic thing that followed orders and did what everybody did, and there was no unique identity to the Borg. They were all just one big giant collective group. So whenever I think of assimilation, and that was their kind of catchphrase was about assimilation and how they were going to assimilate you, and so that's kind of the idea that I associate with the word assimilation, is that growing up, that watching that on television. So when we talk about assimilation or culture change, this can be very problematic because culture is very important to people. Language is important to people. Their customs, their ways of doing things. As teenagers, I'm sure you're realizing that a lot as you try to express your own individuality in some ways, as you are trying to kind of figure out who you are as an individual. I'm sure you're bumping into some traditional cultural things. So you may run into things from your parents. You may run into some things from a religious group. You may get some pushback about maybe the ways you dress or the words you use or things like that. So as you're kind of defining some more unique things about your own identity, you may be finding yourself bumping into culture quite often in those ways, and that's very common because culture is important. It helps us define and make sense of the space around us, and it especially helps us understand how to interact with people, especially people that we know and that we're close to. And we attach lots of personal meaning to a lot of those customs and those cultural things. And so it's not uncommon that you see this tension occur. Another vocabulary that I want to talk about a little bit that kind of goes similar with acculturation and assimilation is the idea of what's called commodification. Commodification is when we take a cultural element from a group and we use it for a different purpose. And often that purpose is based around the idea of making money off of something, or it being based around the idea of profiting. And I don't think that when this is done, it's really done with the intent of being offensive or with the intent of kind of hurting people or making their culture feel bad or things like that. But it often does when you take these things and you take them out of context and you commodify them. So I'm going to take this thing that has important meaning to these people and this group, and I'm going to use it in my own way, often in an unauthentic way, or a way that was not intended or naturally occurring, and I'm going to use it differently, and then I'm going to somehow profit from that. There's a lot of you see guys walking around with Japanese or Chinese or Korean tattoos on their arms. So that might be an example of a commodification, right? I mean, that may be a significant thing. They may know what those words actually mean. That may be something that was kind of really deeply important to them and they thought about it, or it may just look cool, right? And so I'm going to get this on there. Well, okay, well, that's fine, I guess, but that's an example of commodification. So taking things that don't necessarily belong to you culturally, using them for a different purpose. One of the interesting things about this is that as in the U.S. we are often commodifying others, and then we are often commodified as well. And in a world that's kind of driven by technology and the internet and things like that, we see a lot more of this commodification because we're able to see more cultures and we're able to interact with them more, and we are therefore able to borrow things from lots of different groups that we may not have been able to borrow from before because we just didn't know anything about them or understand them in that way. All right, so getting back to this question of culture change. Like I said, I alluded to some of the conflicts that you may be experiencing within your own personal life in terms of culture conflicts. And really what we see on a broad scale is kind of a conflict between two concepts. And one is folk culture and one is popular culture. And they kind of have distinctive characteristics. So for example, folk culture tends to be rural. It tends to be associated with areas that are more isolated geographically, farther away, have less interaction with other people, while pop culture tends to be associated with cities or urban areas or places like that. Folk culture tends to be very homogenous, or you have a lot of similarity in people, a lot of similarities in customs, a lot of similarities in culture, while popular culture tends to be in places that are have lots of different things going on. Folk culture tends to change very, very slowly. It does change, and this is important, as a lot of people assume that folk culture never changes, and it does. It just changes very slowly. While popular culture changes in terms of its rates of change. And so what we see over time is we see folk culture being much more consistent over time in terms of its beliefs, while popular culture may change from day to day to day to day to day. So think about the things that are important to you in terms of your culture, in terms of your surroundings, in terms of what you watch on what your friends talk about, in terms of those kinds of things may change quite frequently. If you live in a suburb or an urban area, or really if you have access to media. That's another big issue is, how much media do you have access to? Where the folk culture people I start really begin to have some anxiety is that folk culture wants to preserve that culture. They see an incredible amount of value and an incredible amount of security, importance in those traditional customs, right? And they want to preserve them. The problem is that increasingly it's getting harder and harder and harder for those folk culture survivalists or folk culture, preservers. It's getting much harder, and the reason for that simply is it's getting harder and harder for them to hold out the influences that make folk culture or that bring pop culture in. It's much harder for them to, for example, avoid television and radio and the internet and things like that. So some examples of folk cultures are interesting. So my wife, who I will refer to her quite a bit because, she's my wife and we do a lot of stuff together. My wife is from Central Ohio. She's from right outside of Columbus. And just northeast of Columbus, Ohio, is what's called Holmes County, Ohio. And Holmes County, Ohio is known for having a large Amish population. And the Amish, there's actually more Amish in Holmes County than there is in places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is supposed to be this big cultural hearth. There's a term that we'll have to come back to later, remind me. Cultural hearth. We had the driving around Holmes County, and the next thing you know, there is we drive by this kind of barn where there's an Amish group there, and they're buying and selling produce. So basically, they had raised this produce on their farms, and they had all come together in a big gathering to sell their produce, right? All right, that makes total sense, right? We're farmers. We sell what we make. The interesting thing, though, is as we went in, so the Amish are known for being resistant to modern technology. So they're resistant to electricity. They're resistant to anything basically newer than like the middle of the 19th century. They don't want to have anything to do with those kind of things, like belt buckles and zippers and things like that even, right? What was interesting about this auction is that as we went in, is this pavilion had a loudspeaker and it had a microphone and it had an auctioneer that was using these things. And we were kind of taken aback because these were supposed to be Amish people. So we went up to the concession stand and we bought some donuts. Amish donuts are awesome, by the way, from one of the Amish women working there. And she said, no, that's okay. Those people are Mennonites. The guys that are running the auction are the Mennonites. So they're allowed to use technology because their religion says they can. As long as we don't use it, it's okay. So there was this interesting kind of, I guess, compromise on the part of the Amish, in that they were allowing someone else to run the auction, someone else to use technology in order to help them sell their products, but because they themselves did not want to have to kind of cross that line. So that idea of folk culture and how folk culture tries to maintain itself, the Amish are just one example of that. By the way, Mennonites and Amish are really kind of different branches of the same kind of group. Obviously, Mennonites are a little more progressive in terms of their beliefs about technology, but they're not that far removed from each other in terms of their other belief systems. But anyway, so that's kind of the way that folk culture plays into those situations. So one of the things that's important about folk culture is to remember that need to preserve and that need to hold on to things. Okay, and pop culture once again provides a lot of tension in trying to maintain and trying to keep um, culture changing rapidly, and so there's this constant give and take and tension between folk culture and pop culture. So just kind of look around you and think about things that might be traditional within your home, within the way you do things, and think about things that may not be. Think about things that have not changed much in a long time, and that maybe kind of indicate within your own life where some of those tensions might be. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some more culture and the change and movement of culture. And one of those is diffusion. So one of the concepts the students kind of struggle with is different types of cultural diffusion. And let's start with the definition of the word diffusion. So diffusion is this idea one thing moves through another, through something else, and to what extent and rate and how much purity is at the end of that process. So when we talk about, say, culture diffusion, what we're talking about is how does culture move from place to place or through space? All right, and there's several different ways to think about this because it doesn't all happen the same way. We don't all gather or gain culture the same way. So the most common kind of diffusion is what we call expansion diffusion, which is expansion diffusion starts in one place and then it gradually spreads out to adjacent places or adjacent things, right? So you get I don't know, you get a CD, right? Or no, did I just say CD? I'm sorry. That's the little round things that play music. I know you probably don't even know those are anymore, but so you get a new song by this new band that you heard and you think it's really cool. So you send it to your friends, and they send it to their friends, and you send it to their friends, and so it kind of moves smoothly and consistently outward in multiple directions. But as it's going, it's touching everybody along the way, right? So, and then eventually everybody in your friend group and then everybody in your school knows about this thing because you found it and you brought it up and you showed it to everybody, right? So that's contagious diffusion. This thing, this cultural element, this cultural idea starts in a place or a location or with a person, and it spreads out to everybody else that they come into contact with, okay? And so think of it as one of the words we also use is contagious diffusion, because think of it as having a disease. I have I have the flu, and I don't know I have it, but I go to school and the people in my class get it because I've infected them, and then they go to their other classes and they're infecting other people there. Next thing you know, the whole school has the flu, and I'm sorry, but I guess I'm the main disease vector or transmitter of that flu. So think about it in that way as one type of diffusion. Another type of diffusion, this is one that I think students really struggle with, is the idea of hierarchical diffusion. Hierarchy implies things move in order of importance from one place to another. So in other words, a thing does not necessarily move to everything adjacent, or does not move in a particular pattern or order. It moves to places that are more important or more receptive first, and then spreads out from there. One of the best examples of this that I can think of is hip hop music, right? Hip hop music is everywhere. It is a very common thing for people, especially young people, teenagers, and even many people into hip hop. When I was a kid, though, when I was growing up in the early mid '80s and early '90s, hip hop was not as common in every other in as it is now. All right. And if we go back and look historically at the spread of hip hop music, one of the things we see is hip hop begins in areas. It begins with people who are often living in poverty, often living in areas that are struggling with crime, that are struggling with poverty. And hip hop was a way for the pair to kind of talk about their experiences and talk about the lives that they were living then, right? And what ended up happening is that hip hop did spread. Hip hop did move. It did go from where it started to other places. But what it would do is it would move from from one inner city urban community to another, because other urban inner city communities could understand those problems, had similar experiences, and used that same media or same art form to communicate some of those kinds of things. So you might have hip hop start in Los Angeles and then spread to Denver and then spread to Chicago and then spread to St. Louis and spread to Cleveland and things like that. So it's jumping from large city to large city based on the fact that the kind of the inner city urban populations of those cities really found these things meaningful and important and wanted to embrace this particular thing. Meanwhile, everybody in between those areas were not catching on to hip hop. They weren't exposed to it. It wasn't something that they were necessarily interested in at first. So hip hop moves from urban area to urban area to urban area, kind of jumping over all the land in between. It may go from Chicago to St. Louis, but it may skip, all of the rest of Illinois, right? Or it may skip from, New York City to Cleveland, but it's going to skip, upstate New York because, it doesn't have the same population that can connect to it. Okay. Over time, though, it continues to spread and gain popularity. And in some ways, we could use the word commodification as it goes from being a musical or artistic movement in these inner city urban areas to being a more popular, mainstream, broadly accepted musical form. And then other people begin to adopt it and accept it. And now, middle class, upper middle class suburban kids are listening to Eminem or Kanye or Beyonce or things like that. And no one thinks twice about it. 30 years ago, that would have been strange because I don't know what this is. These aren't my experiences. This isn't my understanding as a, middle class, suburban dwelling teenager. But now it's not necessarily associated with those things in the same way. So that's hierarchical diffusion. Starts with a group or place that is very receptive to it, but skips everything in between and eventually slowly trickles right? So if you are listening to hip hop music today and you are an upper middle class suburban teenager, know that 30 years ago you would have been listening to very different things because that just wasn't as available, nor was it something that you necessarily connected with. So that's hierarchical. The other one that's important and simple is the idea of relocation. And that is when people physically move, and when they do, they bring their culture with them, right? We see a lot of this happening when we see immigrant communities, pop up, when we see ethnic neighborhoods develop. We see the idea of relocation. So there is a lot about our culture here in the U.S. that because of this idea of relocation. All right. So those are some of the big concepts about culture that you need to be familiar with. The other one that I think is important is the idea of region. I think students kind of struggle with this idea of region, but region is one of our 5 major themes of geography. So we really want to make sure we understand region. And region is just a way to define something based on similarities, right? So region is a way to define a geographical area based on similarities. But there are different ways to define it. So there are different types of similarities that we can use to define it. So one of them is a formal region. And formal has very strongly, not strongly may not be the best word, but very well-defined borders and boundaries. You can tell very clearly where X, Y, and Z stops based on those borders, right? So if we look at a map, a lot of times we see these things. We see state borders, we see geographic features that form borders, things like that. So if it has a defined region, or I'm sorry, a defined border, then that's a formal region. Formal regions have a high degree of homogeneity, so a lot of similarity within the borders of that particular place. And so, for example, like I said, states, things like that. Another important type of region is what we call a functional region, and this one's a little harder to define. And I think students tend to struggle a little more with this idea of functional region. But a functional region is a region that is defined by the type of activity that goes on there, right? So it may not have it may not be formally defined. It may not have strong boundaries like a formal region might have, but there is a similarity within the region based on what people do. So this is where we have things like the Bible Belt as an example of that. Actually, that's probably not the best example. But let's say we look at the broadcast radius of a TV station, right? Or the broadcast radius of a radio station. That's going to be a functional region, in that people within that region have that in common. If they all listen to that or they all watch that, then that's a functional region. It could be based around the types of economic activities that might occur there. So, you know, there's this awesome place just west of Miami, Florida. My wife and I went to the Everglades last year. I mean, while we were at the Everglades National Park, of course, while we were there, we went to this little place called Hialeah, Florida. And Hialeah is just west of Miami, and it's in this really awesome agricultural region. Where they have all kinds of farms that grow all kinds of different fruits and vegetables and things like that. And what's cool is it's one of the few places in the U.S. where you can find some pretty exotic things in terms of food. The county, in Miami-Dade County, has a public park where they actually grow all kinds of things that are not available anywhere else in the country. And you can go in there and you can sample things from all over the world. Anyway, so in this, right outside of Hialeah, Florida, is a region called the Redlands. And the Redlands is this awesome area that has all of these different agricultural activities going on. And you can go, and there's fruit stands, and you can go and get like smoothies made with all of these different types of food. But this is a functional region, because it's defined, the Redlands, which is its title, really defines the type of economic activity that goes on there, and that most of these people and most of this land is used for the cultivation of tropical fruit. Okay, so that's the idea of a functional region. Another reason is a perceptual region. And a perceptual region is something that is really hard to define, but a lot of people would say that it exists, right? So it's not necessarily we can list characteristics of it. It's not necessarily that we can talk about everyone does the same thing, but there are just these particular things about a part of or an area that everybody kind of says, yeah, it exists, right? So for example, we could say the South. All right. So where does the South begin? Where does the South end? Well, that's a long time American history argument, right? Or Dixie. Dixie is an old term from the 19th century, which refers to the really old, deep, traditional South. Where does that start? Where does it end? I don't know. It's not necessarily a formal region. Well, okay, what kind of things go on in Dixie? Well, lots of different things go on there. Lots of different types of activities. Lots of different types of human interactions and human behaviors go on there. So it's really hard to say that it's a functional region. But at the same time, we could talk about, yeah, Dixie's a thing, and the South is a thing. It has these things that we could probably point to. We could talk about its history. We could talk about some of its cultural elements. We could talk about some of the things that make it unique, and some of the things that they themselves would define as unique about them. But beyond that, it's kind of hard to define. So it's perceived in that everyone kind of admits it and likes it and agrees to it, but it's hard to put on paper, or it's hard to point to, or it's hard to show on a map where it begins or where it ends, or what parts of it are not. Okay, so those are some different types of regions that you'll want to be familiar with moving forward. Okay, there's lots of vocabulary in the culture unit. I would recommend that you go back and look at some of that vocabulary and think about kind of what's most important. So I'm going to leave you to that at this point and move on to some other topics. So once again, the idea of assimilation and culture change, the idea of diffusion, the idea of pop versus folk culture, the ideas of region are all very important concepts. All right, so let's move on to a couple of things that you probably will also want to know for the test, and that is religion, which is part of culture, which is kind of this interesting subset of culture itself, in that when we start talking about religion, we start studying religion, I think we're always a little bit careful about it, because we don't want to offend people. We don't want to overly analyze and be overly scientific in our analysis of things, of people's faith. We always want to, I think, be very careful. However, there are some important concepts that kind of arise geographically out of the idea of religion. And one of the things that I really want to talk about is the idea of universalizing versus ethnic. I'm sorry, I almost forgot the word. Universalizing versus ethnic religions. And so one of the things that there are lots of different distinctions between these, but some of the main features are that if you are part of an ethnic religion, more than likely you were born into it, meaning that the religion and the rest of the culture are very much the same. So the culture and the ways of life and the behaviors and the belief systems are kind of ingrained into everyday life and everything that you do. You are born into it. You do not, or at least you are part of the group from birth. Let's put it that way. There is not a conscious decision to say, I am part of this group. You just are born into it in that way. So some of the strongest kind of ethnic religions are Hinduism in South Asia and Judaism in lots of different places. One of the things that's interesting about these is that because you're born into it, there really is no emphasis on conversion. We're not going to make new Hindus. We're not going to make new Jews. Why? Because you're born into it. You either are or you're not from birth. And so what we see is if we take migration out of the equation, we see a lot of geographic isolation of ethnic religions. So we see Hinduism, kind of clustered in South Asia, and then we see, a lot of diaspora or spreading from migration of that. But that spreading is not based on conversion. It wasn't like people went there and said, you should be Hindu. And they said, awesome, we'll do that. That's because actual Hindus moved to other places. Actual people that practice Judaism moved to other places, and that's why they're there, that relocation diffusion thing, right? So those are ethnic religions. Like, we can look around and we can say, man, there's a lot of practitioners of Judaism in the United States. Absolutely. That's because they moved here and their families continued to grow generation after generation. Okay, this differs from what we call universalizing religions. Universalizing religions let me back up 1 second. Ethnic religions tend to often say, "Hey, we're going to do our thing. This is our thing. It's what we do. It's important to us. If we don't need you to do it, you don't have to do it. We're not necessarily interested in you coming on board with us. If you want, you can. I guess that's fine. But for the most part, we're just going to do our thing." Universalizing religions, on the other hand, are actively convert or actively increase their numbers through conversion. What that means is I practice this, I believe this, and you need to also. And that we have the right idea, and you need the right idea also. So we are going to do what we can to try to convert you to believe the way that we believe. Unfortunately, over time, that this conversion process or attempts to convert has not always been nice and friendly and smooth. A lot of times throughout history, that conversion process, or that desire to make sure that everybody believes the same way we do because our way is right, has often led to some pretty unfortunate and disastrous consequences, whether it be the Crusades, whether it be the Spanish Inquisition, whether it be everything associated with colonization by Europeans, or even today, with extreme people that claim. I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying they claim Islam as part of their belief system. Obviously, they do not follow Islam, but they claim to, and they use that as justification. Anyway, so the two major religions that are universalizing in the world today are Christianity and Islam. One of the more interesting kind of challenges to that is that Christianity and Islam have the same geographical origin in the same part of the world. So there's always been some uneasy tension between those groups, even though both religions, if you look at them at their heart, are actually very accepting of others and very tolerant of others. But they do claim one truth, and one truth to be the only truth, and a need for everyone to believe in that truth, or there is consequences. And so that's where the universalizing part comes in. So what we see is that universalizing religions spread through conversion. They spread through people going from one religion to another, where ethnic religions don't. Ethnic religions tend to spread through just natural population growth in their relatively limited geographical areas. Okay. All right. Some other important concepts to think about religion. One is the idea of kind of animism, and the way that and the idea of sacred spaces, and how is the physical landscape affected by culture. Religion is a very common way that we see the physical landscape affected by culture. So if you go from place to place to place, you will often see very recognizable elements of religion that have been marked on culture. So whether it be steeples or crosses or crescents, or particular architectural shapes or architectural traditions, are often going to be associated with those things. And you can physically see those things on the landscape. Okay, so that idea of cultural landscape, that idea of how does human activity, human behavior, human customs, how does it affect and how does it influence what we see around us, and how we physically manipulate or physically transform the environment. So religion is a really common example of that. Drive around any town in America and just count the number of churches that you see, and they're usually very recognizable or distinctive in some way. Their architecture tends to be a certain way. Okay, so those are some things to think about in terms of religion. One is, what are these religions? What are universalizing? What are ethnic? What are the differences between those? And how does religion particularly impact or influence? Whoa! I just hit the computer. Impact or influence the cultural landscape. Okay, I'm about out of time. I feel like I have talked a lot today. So I'm actually going to put off language until next week. So next week we will do language and then do what I think is my favorite of all of the units, which is politics. We'll do political geography and language next week. Those things actually go together better than you might think. So go online and ask questions about culture and politics. I'm sorry, language and politics, and we'll get to those. I have no idea where the time went. I was rambling, talking about national parks and things, but hopefully I did not waste too much of your time. Hopefully you got a lot out of our time today together. Hopefully I generated some questions. Feel free to ask those questions, and I will go online and try to respond to those if I can. And so that is our plan for next week. So politics. And we will pick up the part of religion that we did not get to today. I'm sorry, the part of language that we did not get to today. All right. All righty. We'll see you then. Bye.